Welcome back to the channel, where we explore the quieter, stranger, and often surprising corners of history. Today's story is a little different, because some of the most famous people from the medieval world may never have existed at all, across castles, monasteries, and village taverns. Medieval stories spread far and wide tales of brave heroes, mysterious travelers, wandering knights, and even powerful rulers. But over time, some of these figures slipped out of legend and into what many people now believe is real history. In this video, we'll uncover several medieval figures who are widely believed to have lived, but whose existence is actually doubtful, exaggerated, or completely invented. Some were created by storytellers. Others grew out of rumors, propaganda, or simple misunderstandings that lasted for centuries. So who were these mysterious characters? How did they become so famous? And why do so many people still believe they were real? Settle in, get comfortable, and let's gently step back into the medieval world to separate history from legend. But before we begin, if you enjoy calm, fascinating history like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling us which historical myths or legends you'd love to see explored next. And if you enjoy this journey, be sure to check out the other relaxing history stories on the channel as well. Now, let's begin. Picture Europe about 1,000 years ago. No internet, no newspapers, no television. For most people, there were not even books. In the medieval world, information traveled slowly, very slowly. A story might begin in one town and take years to reach another. And along the way, that story would change a little, then a little more, until eventually it became something entirely different. In those days, truth and imagination lived very close together, and that is where our story begins. Medieval Europe was a place where history, rumor, religion, and myth blended together like fog over a quiet valley. People believed incredible things, not because they were foolish, but because they lived in a world where reliable information was rare. Most people could not read or write. In fact, in many parts of Europe, only monks, priests, and a small number of nobles were literate. So how did news travel? Through voices. Travelers told stories at roadside inns. Merchants shared rumors from distant cities. Pilgrims carried tales from holy lands. And wandering performers called minstrels spread dramatic legends from village to village. If a minstrel told a story about a great hero, people believed it. Why wouldn't they? There was no easy way to check. Imagine hearing a traveler claim that somewhere far away, beyond mountains and deserts, there lived a powerful Christian emperor ruling over a land filled with gold and strange animals. If 10 different travelers told similar stories, it started to sound very convincing. Soon, people would repeat the story as if it were fact, and just like that, a legend was born. Now, medieval people did not always separate history from storytelling the way we do today. A chronicler, someone who wrote down events, might record a miracle, a rumor, or a heroic tale right alongside real political events. To them, all of it was part of history. And that is why medieval records can be so fascinating and so confusing. Some of the figures described in these records were real kings, real soldiers, and real saints. But others, they never existed at all. Yet people believed in them for centuries. In fact, some of these characters are still widely believed today. Take King Arthur, the famous ruler of Camelot. According to legend, he pulled a magical sword from a stone, ruled over noble knights, and defended Britain from invading armies. For hundreds of years, people were absolutely certain he was a real king, but historians still cannot find solid proof that he ever lived. Then there is Prester John, a mysterious Christian emperor that medieval Europeans believe ruled somewhere far away in the east. Entire expeditions were launched in search of his kingdom. Of course, no such kingdom was ever found. Another strange story tells of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man and secretly became pope. The legend claims she ruled the church for years before her identity was revealed in the most dramatic way imaginable. For centuries, people repeated this story as if it were historical fact. Today, historians are almost certain it never happened. Then there is Robin Hood, the cheerful outlaw of Sherwood Forest, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. He appears in songs, plays, books, movies, and probably every elementary school history lesson at some point. But the real question remains, was there ever actually a Robin Hood? Or was he simply a character that slowly grew out of medieval folklore? And finally, there is perhaps one of the strangest legends of all, Wandering Jew, a man cursed to wander the earth forever after insulting Jesus during the crucifixion. For hundreds of years, people claimed to have seen him. They described meeting him in cities all across Europe. A man who never aged, a man who never died, a man who had been walking the world for over 1,000 years. Was any of it real? Almost certainly not, but people believed it anyway. So this raises an interesting question. Why? Why did medieval people create these characters? And maybe an even more interesting question. Why do many people still believe in them today? Part of the answer lies in the way medieval society worked. In a world without fast communication, stories filled the gaps where knowledge was missing. When people did not understand something, whether it was distant lands, political events, or strange natural phenomena, they often turned to storytelling. Stories made the world feel less mysterious. Sometimes, those stories explained power. Kings and nobles loved legends that made them look heroic or chosen by destiny. If a ruler could claim connection to a legendary king or saint, it made their authority feel stronger. Other legends served religious purposes. They warned people about sin, taught moral lessons, or inspired faith. And some stories were simply entertaining, because people have always loved a good tale, especially a tale with brave knights, hidden kingdoms, magical swords, and heroic outlaws. Over time, these stories grew larger. A rumor became a legend became history, and once something is written down in an old book, especially a book written by a monk in a quiet monastery, it suddenly feels very official, even if it started as a campfire story. This strange mix of fact and fiction is one of the most fascinating parts of medieval history. When historians look back at old chronicles, they often find themselves asking the same question again and again. Did this really happen? Or did someone simply tell a very good story? Sometimes the answer is surprisingly hard to find, because once a legend becomes popular enough, it begins to live its own life. It spreads through songs, poems, paintings, and eventually books. Long after the original storyteller is gone, long after the truth is forgotten. And so, throughout the medieval world, a strange collection of heroes, rulers, saints, and wanderers slowly took shape. People spoke their names with confidence. People wrote about them in serious histories. Some even built monuments and traditions around them. All four figures who may have never walked the earth at all. Over the next chapters, we are going to explore these characters. Some were legendary kings, some were wandering travelers, some were saints, or sinners, or mysterious rulers hidden somewhere beyond the edges of the known world. All of them were believed to be real, and every one of them reveals something fascinating about the medieval mind, because sometimes the stories people believe tell us more about history than the facts themselves. And our first legend might just be the most famous medieval ruler of them all. A king with a magical sword, a kingdom called Camelot, and a story that refuses to fade. The legend of King Arthur. Somewhere in the misty hills of ancient Britain, according to legend, there once lived a king unlike any other. A king who pulled a sword from a stone. A king who ruled from a shining court called Camelot. A king surrounded by noble warriors known as the Knights of the Round Table. His name was King Arthur. For centuries, people across Europe believed he was one of the greatest rulers in history. His stories were told in castles, monasteries, and village taverns. Knights tried to live by his example. Kings claimed to be his descendants. But there is one small problem. No one can prove that he ever existed. Now, that might sound surprising. After all, the story of King Arthur feels ancient and solid, like it must come from a real historical time. But when historians began looking closely at the evidence, things started to get a little foggy. Let's start with when Arthur was supposed to live. Most legends place him around the late 400s or early 500s. This was a chaotic time in Britain. The Roman Empire had recently collapsed, leaving the island without strong leadership. Various tribes and warlords fought for power while new invaders, especially the Saxons, pushed into the land. If there had been a powerful warrior king defending Britain during this time, historians might expect to find records of him. But strangely, the earliest reliable writings from that era say nothing about Arthur. Not a word. No great battles led by Arthur. No kingdom called Camelot. No magical sword. The first clear mentions of Arthur appear hundreds of years later. One of the most important sources is a 12th century writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around the year 1136, Geoffrey wrote a book called Historia Regum Britannia, or the History of the Kings of Britain. Despite the title, the book was not exactly what modern historians would call reliable. Geoffrey mixed real historical events with folklore, legends, and what might generously be described as creative storytelling. And right in the middle of it all was King Arthur. According to Geoffrey, Arthur was a powerful ruler who united Britain and defeated the Saxons in a series of great battles. His kingdom was glorious, his knights were heroic, and his reign represented a golden age of courage and honor. The book was wildly popular. People loved it. Soon other writers began expanding the story. They added new characters, new adventures, and new magical elements. This is when many of the famous details appeared. The wizard, Merlin, who guided Arthur from childhood. The sword Excalibur, which proved his right to rule. The noble Camelot, where knights gathered around the Round Table. And the quest for the mysterious Holy Grail. Over time, the legend grew bigger and richer. Medieval poets in France and Britain added romantic adventures and heroic quests. Knights fought dragons, rescued maidens, and searched for divine treasures. By the late Middle Ages, Arthur had become the perfect king. Brave, just, wise. Basically the kind of king every real ruler wished they could be. And that is where this story gets interesting, because medieval kings were paying very close attention. Several rulers in England actively encouraged the Arthurian legends. Why? Because being connected to King Arthur made them look impressive. For example, Henry II of England promoted stories about Arthur's grave being discovered. According to the tale, monks at Glastonbury Abbey uncovered the bones of Arthur and his queen. Conveniently, this helped prove that Arthur had truly existed. Even more conveniently, it suggested that England's current rulers were inheriting his legacy. In other words, the legend became political. And politics can keep a good story alive for a very long time. But modern historians remain cautious. There is still no solid archaeological evidence for Arthur. No royal tomb clearly linked to him. No contemporary documents describing his rule. That does not necessarily mean the legend came from nothing. Some scholars believe Arthur may have been inspired by a real war leader, Romano-British commander, who fought against Saxon invaders. Over time, his story might have grown larger with every retelling. Imagine a brave soldier whose victory becomes famous. Then, decades later, storytellers add new details. Then poets turn him into a heroic king. Then writers add magic swords and wizard advisors. After a few hundred years, you end up with King Arthur, a man who might have started as a real person, but who slowly transformed into something much bigger than history, a symbol. And symbols can be incredibly powerful. Arthur represented the dream of a united Britain, a time when justice ruled, knights were honorable, and good always defeated evil. Whether he existed or not almost stopped mattering, because the story itself was too good to disappear. Even today, the legend is everywhere. Movies, novels, television shows, and video games continue to retell the tale. Every generation reshapes Arthur to fit its own imagination, which is rather impressive for someone who might never have lived at all. But Arthur was far from the only medieval figure like this. In fact, while Europeans were telling stories about a legendary king in Britain, they were also whispering about another mysterious ruler far beyond their borders. A powerful Christian emperor who supposedly ruled somewhere in the distant east. A king surrounded by unimaginable wealth. A king whose kingdom was filled with wonders no European had ever seen. And for centuries, explorers searched the world trying to find him. His name was Prester John, and his story would send people on some of the strangest quests in medieval history. During the Middle Ages, Europe often felt surrounded. To the south and east were powerful Islamic empires. Trade routes stretched across lands Europeans barely understood. Beyond the horizon lay enormous territories filled with unfamiliar cultures, languages, and religions. For many medieval Europeans, the wider world was mysterious and intimidating. So when a rumor began spreading about a powerful Christian king living somewhere in the East, people were very eager to believe it. This mysterious ruler was known as Prester John. According to the stories, Prester John was not just a king. He was an emperor of extraordinary power and wealth. His kingdom was said to be filled with wonders beyond imagination. Rivers flowed with precious stones. Cities glittered with gold. Strange creatures roamed the land griffins, giants, and other animals that sounded like they had wandered straight out of a medieval bestiary. It was a place where miracles seemed almost ordinary. And best of all, it was supposedly a Christian kingdom. This detail was extremely important. At the time, Europe was deeply involved in the Crusades, long conflicts between Christian and Muslim powers over control of sacred lands. Many Europeans hoped that allies might exist somewhere beyond the territories they knew. So when stories of Prester John appeared, they felt like a sign of hope. Imagine discovering that somewhere out there was a powerful Christian emperor who could help turn the tide of war. Naturally, people wanted to know more. And then, around the middle of the 12th century, something remarkable appeared. A document known as the Letter of Prester John began circulating across Europe. The letter claimed to be written by Prester John himself. In it, the mysterious ruler described his kingdom in astonishing detail. According to the letter, his empire contained incredible riches, magical landscapes, and peaceful lands where justice always prevailed. He claimed to command armies of unimaginable size. His palace, the letter said, was filled with jewels and precious metals. Exotic animals wandered the royal gardens. Rare spices and foods were abundant. Some parts of the letter became almost comically extravagant. At one point, it described rivers filled with gemstones and lands where people lived for hundreds of years. But medieval readers were not particularly skeptical. In fact, they were fascinated. Copies of the letter spread quickly. Scholars discussed it. Kings read it. Clergy studied it. Soon, many people accepted the story as genuine. And once the legend took hold, it began influencing real decisions. European rulers started trying to locate Prester John's kingdom. Diplomats and travelers searched for clues about where he might live. At first, many believed his empire was somewhere in India. After all, India had long been associated with distant wonders and exotic wealth in medieval imagination. Later, some explorers suspected the kingdom might be located in Central Asia. Still later, attention shifted toward Ethiopia, which did in fact have a long-standing Christian monarchy. For centuries, explorers kept looking. Portuguese explorers sailing around. Africa, in the 1400s, were partly motivated by the hope of finding Prester John's kingdom and forming an alliance. Imagine that, a fictional king helping inspire real voyages across the ocean. That is the strange power of belief. Eventually, European travelers did make contact with the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. For a time, some people thought they had finally discovered Prester John's land, but the Ethiopian rulers themselves seemed rather confused by the idea. They had never heard of Prester John. Slowly, scholars began to suspect something was wrong. The famous letter describing his kingdom did not match any real place. Many details sounded exaggerated or copied from older myths. And perhaps most importantly, no one had ever actually met Prester John. Historians now believe the letter of Prester John was almost certainly a medieval forgery. It may have been written by a European author who wanted to inspire hope during difficult political times, or perhaps someone simply enjoyed telling a good story. Either way, the legend had already spread too far to disappear easily. For generations, people continued searching for this imaginary emperor. Maps included guesses about where his kingdom might be. Chronicles mentioned him as if he were a genuine ruler. The story lingered in the European imagination long after scholars began doubting its authenticity. And that is what makes the legend of Prester John so fascinating. It shows how a simple story, possibly written by one anonymous author, could influence the politics, exploration, and geography of an entire continent. A fictional king helped shape real history, which is honestly quite impressive. But the Middle Ages had many strange legends, and some of them were even more shocking, because while the story of Prester John involved a mythical king ruling somewhere far away, the next legend claimed that something far more unbelievable had happened much closer to home. According to medieval rumor, a woman once managed to secretly become the leader of the entire Catholic Church. A woman who disguised herself as a man. A woman who rose through the ranks of the clergy. a woman who eventually became Pope. Her name, at least according to the legend, was Pope Joan, and the way her story supposedly ended was unforgettable. The medieval world was full of strange stories, but few were as shocking or as widely believed as the legend of Pope Joan. According to the tale, sometime in the 9th century, a woman managed to disguise herself as a man, climb the ranks of the Catholic Church, and eventually become the Pope. Yes, the Pope, leader of the entire Christian Church. Now, if that sounds unbelievable, that's because it probably is. But for hundreds of years, many people were absolutely convinced the story was true. The legend usually begins with a young woman who is said to be incredibly intelligent. In most versions of the story, she was born somewhere in Europe, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in England. The details changed depending on who was telling the tale. But one thing remained consistent. She loved learning. At a time when women were rarely allowed to study, this young woman reportedly disguised herself as a man so she could receive an education. Using a male identity, she traveled across Europe studying philosophy, theology, and religious texts, and apparently she was very good at it. So good, in fact, that she eventually joined the clergy. Step by step, she moved higher within the church hierarchy. People admired her intelligence, her discipline, and her deep knowledge of religious teachings. Eventually, according to the legend, she arrived in Rome, the center of the Catholic world. And this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Somehow, the disguised woman continued rising through the church until she was elected Pope. Yes, elected. The story claims that she ruled successfully for several years under the name Pope John. Nobody suspected the truth, but legends have a way of saving their biggest surprises for the end. According to the most famous version of the tale, the truth was revealed during a public religious procession. As the Pope rode through the streets of Rome, surrounded by clergy and crowds, something unexpected happened. She suddenly went into labor, right there in the middle of the procession. The story says she gave birth in the street, shocking everyone around her. In an instant, her secret was exposed. What happened next varies depending on the storyteller. Some versions say the crowd was furious and immediately killed her. Others say she died during childbirth. A few calmer versions claim the church quietly removed her from power. But no matter which version you hear, the message is the same. The church had unknowingly been led by a woman. It sounds like the kind of dramatic twist you might expect in a modern movie. But during the Middle Ages, people took the story very seriously. In fact, the legend began appearing in written histories. Medieval chroniclers recorded the story as if it were a genuine historical event. Some writers even attempted to place her reign within official lists of popes. One influential writer who helped spread the story was Martin of Opava. His historical writings included the tale of Pope Joan, which helped the legend spread widely across Europe. Soon, the story appeared in sermons, books, and public discussions. Many people accepted it as fact, and once again, we have to ask why. Why would such a strange story become so widely believed? Historians today think the legend likely served several purposes. First, it may have been used as criticism of the Church. During the Middle Ages, there were periods when the papacy faced political conflict and accusations of corruption. A story about a woman secretly becoming pope could have been used to embarrass or criticize church leadership. Second, the story functioned as a moral lesson. Medieval storytelling often included dramatic warnings about deception, pride, or breaking social rules. The tale of Pope Joan may have been intended as a cautionary story about disguise and ambition. And third, people simply loved dramatic stories, especially stories involving secrets, disguises, and shocking revelations. For centuries, the legend continued, spreading. Some writers even claimed the church had introduced strange traditions to prevent such an event from happening again. One rumor suggested that new popes had to sit on a special chair designed to confirm that they were male. Historians today find no reliable evidence for that story either, but the rumor added even more intrigue to the legend. Eventually, scholars began examining the historical record more carefully, and when they did, the story started to fall apart. There were no reliable documents from the 9th century mentioning Pope Joan, no contemporary accounts, no official church records describing such a scandal. In fact, when historians looked at the timeline of actual popes, there was no gap where Joan could have ruled. The story had appeared centuries later, long after the events it described. In other words, it was almost certainly fictional. Yet despite this, the legend remained incredibly popular for hundreds of years. Even during the Renaissance, when scholars were becoming more careful about historical accuracy, many people still repeated the story. Because once a legend becomes famous, it can be very difficult to erase. Today, most historians agree that Pope Joan almost certainly never existed. But the legend remains fascinating because it shows how powerful storytelling can be. A tale that may have begun as satire, rumor, or political criticism eventually became accepted as historical truth by thousands of people. And in some ways, the story of Pope Joan tells us more about medieval society than many real historical events. It reveals the tensions within the church, the fascination with hidden identities, the love of dramatic storytelling, and perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that medieval people were not so different from us. They loved a good scandal just as much as anyone today. But not all medieval legends involved kings or popes. Some of the most famous figures were not rulers at all. Instead, they were rebels, outlaws, men who lived outside the law and challenged powerful authorities. And perhaps the most beloved outlaw in all of medieval folklore was a cheerful bandit said to live in the forests of England, a man who robbed the rich, helped the poor, and always seemed to escape the sheriff. His name was Robin Hood. If you ask someone to name a famous outlaw from history, chances are the first name they'll say is Robin Hood, the man in green, the master archer of the forest, the outlaw who robbed the rich and gave the money to the poor. It is one of the most famous legends in English history. Robin Hood has appeared in songs, plays, books, movies, cartoons, and even video games. His story has been told for hundreds of years, and yet, despite all that fame, there is still one big mystery. Was Robin Hood ever a real person, or was he simply a character born from medieval imagination? To answer that question, we have to travel back to medieval England. Not the shiny version we often see in movies, but the real one. Life for ordinary people in the Middle Ages was not easy. Most people were peasants who worked long hours farming land that belonged to powerful nobles. Taxes were heavy, laws were strict, and if someone challenged the authority of the crown or the local lord, the punishment could be severe. England also had a complicated legal system involving forests. Large areas of land were declared royal forests, meaning they belonged to the king. Hunting animals in those forests without permission was considered a serious crime, and people did it anyway, because when you are poor and hungry, the king's deer might start looking like dinner, This is the kind of world where stories about rebellious outlaws begin to grow. According to legend, Robin Hood lived in Sherwood Forest, hiding among the trees with a band of loyal companions. These companions were just as legendary as Robin himself. There was Little John, who despite his name was supposedly very tall. There was Friar Tuck, the cheerful monk who liked food almost as much as adventure. There was Will Scarlet, known for his bright clothing and quick temper. And of course, there was Robin's rival, the lawman constantly trying to capture him, the Sheriff of Nottingham. In most stories, the sheriff represents corruption and unfair authority. Robin, meanwhile, represents justice. The classic tale usually goes like this. Robin and his band hide in the forest, ambushing wealthy travelers and corrupt officials. They take gold, food, or goods, then secretly distribute the stolen wealth to poor villagers. The rich become poorer, the poor become happier, and Robin escapes every trap the sheriff sets. It is a very satisfying story. But when historians started looking for evidence of a real Robin Hood, things became a little complicated. The earliest surviving references to Robin Hood appear in medieval ballads, which were popular narrative songs performed by traveling entertainers. One of the oldest surviving examples is a ballad called A Jest of Robin Hood, written sometime around the 1400s. These ballads describe Robin as a skilled outlaw living in the forest with his companions. But interestingly, the earliest versions of the story are quite different from the version most people know today. For example, early Robin Hood stories do not focus much on helping the poor. Instead, Robin mainly robs wealthy church officials and travelers. He is more of a clever trickster than a social justice hero. The steal from the rich and give to the poor theme became stronger later, especially during the 16th century. Another interesting detail is Robin's social status. In modern stories, Robin is often portrayed as a nobleman sometimes called the Earl of Huntingdon, who becomes an outlaw after being wronged by corrupt rulers. But the earliest ballads describe him as something different. A yeoman in medieval England. A yeoman was a free commoner, someone who was not a noble, but also not a peasant tied to the land. In other words, Robin Hood originally represented the ordinary working man, not a fallen aristocrat. So where did the legend come from? There are several theories. Some historians believe Robin Hood may have been inspired by real outlaws. Records from medieval England mention several criminals with similar names, such as Robert Hood or Robehot. But these individuals appear in different places and times. None of them clearly match the famous legend. Another theory is that Robin Hood became a nickname used for outlaws in general, much like how people today might refer to a mysterious hacker or thief with a symbolic name. If that is true, the legend may have grown from many different outlaw stories slowly merging together. Over time, storytellers combined various adventures into a single heroic character, and the character became larger with every retelling. During the late Middle Ages, Robin Hood's stories became incredibly popular during village festivals. People even performed plays where local actors dressed as Robin and his companions. These performances were part entertainment, part celebration. Imagine medieval villagers cheering as their local Robin Hood tricked the sheriff on stage. It must have been great fun. The legend continued, evolving over the centuries. By the time the Renaissance arrived, writers had reshaped Robin Hood into a more noble figure. He became a defender of justice, a loyal supporter of the rightful king, and a protector of the poor. In many later stories, Robin supports Richard the Lionheart while opposing the corrupt rule of Prince John. This version of the story is extremely popular today, but interestingly, it does not appear in the earliest ballads. It was added centuries later, which shows once again how legends evolve. So, was Robin Hood real? Most historians today believe the answer is probably no, at least not in the way the legend describes him. There may have been real outlaws who inspired parts of the story. There may even have been a particularly famous criminal whose reputation spread through song. But the Robin Hood we know today, the master archer, the cheerful rebel, the defender of the poor, is almost certainly a creation of folklore, and yet the legend continues to thrive. Why? Because Robin Hood represents something people have always admired. A person who stands up to unfair authority. A clever underdog who outwits powerful enemies. A hero who fights for ordinary people. These kinds of characters appear in cultures all around the world. Robin Hood just happens to be England's most famous version, which is why his story has lasted for more than 600 years. And if you visit Sherwood Forest today, you will still find statues, signs, and stories celebrating the legendary outlaw. Tourists walk through the woods imagining where Robin and his companions might have hidden, even if historians are fairly sure he never existed. But Robin Hood was not the only rebel hero to emerge from medieval England. Another figure far less famous today, but very important in his own time, was a warrior who supposedly resisted the Norman conquerors. After the invasion of 1066, his name was Hereward the Wake, and like many medieval heroes, his story sits somewhere between history and legend. In the years after the famous Norman conquest, England was a tense and uneasy place. A new king now ruled the land, William the Conqueror. His armies had crossed the English Channel from Normandy, defeated the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, and claimed the English crown. But conquering a country is one thing. Keeping it under control is another. Many English nobles and warriors were not happy about Norman rule. Some accepted the new king, others quietly resisted, and in the middle of this uncertain time, stories began spreading about a rebellious warrior named Hereward the Wake. Unlike some of the legends we have talked about so far, Hereward probably did exist. His name appears in several historical records from the 11th century, but the problem is that the stories about him quickly became exaggerated, very exaggerated. Over time, Hereward transformed from a rebellious noble into something much bigger, legendary hero who seemed almost impossible to defeat. Let's start with the historical background. After the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror began redistributing land across England. Anglo-Saxon nobles lost their estates, which were handed to Norman lords loyal to the king. For many English families, it felt like their entire world had been turned upside down. One of the regions where resistance remained strong was the eastern part of England, especially around the marshlands of East Anglia. This area contained a wild and difficult landscape known as the Fens. The Fens were not easy terrain. They were filled with swamps, reeds, narrow waterways, and patches of dry land scattered like islands across the marsh. To outsiders, the area was confusing and dangerous. But to local people who knew the landscape, it was the perfect hiding place. And according to the legends, that is exactly where Hereward made his stand. Many stories place his stronghold on the island monastery of Ely Abbey, which stood on one of the few solid pieces of land in the marsh. From there, Hereward and his followers supposedly launched raids against Norman forces. They ambushed patrols. They attacked supply lines, and they vanished back into the swamps before Norman soldiers could catch them. If that sounds a little familiar, it is because the story of Hereward shares some similarities with the legend of Robin Hood, a rebel leader, a loyal band of followers, a struggle against powerful authorities, and a landscape that helps the rebels stay hidden. But the legends of Hereward become even more dramatic. According to later medieval writers, Hereward was a fearless warrior with incredible strength and cunning. One famous story claims that Norman soldiers tried to capture him by secretly approaching Ely, disguised as fishermen. Unfortunately for them, Hereward spotted the trick immediately. The story says he attacked them himself and sent them running for their lives. Another tale describes Norman forces attempting to reach Ely by building a wooden walkway across the marshes. The plan was to march an army straight into the rebel stronghold. But once again, the legend says Hereward discovered the plan. He supposedly led a surprise attack that destroyed the walkway and sent Norman soldiers tumbling into the muddy water. Stories like these made Hereward seem unstoppable. But historians today suspect that many of these dramatic details were added long after the real events. One of the most important sources for the legend is a medieval text called the Gesta Herewardi, which means the deeds of Hereward. The book was written decades after Hereward's supposed rebellion. It mixes historical information with heroic storytelling in a way that feels very similar to medieval adventure tales. In the Gesta Herewardi, Hereward becomes a much larger-than-life character. He fights duels. He defeats enemies with clever tricks. He travels across Europe on daring adventures before returning to England to fight the Normans. In one particularly dramatic story, Hereward disguises himself as a potter to sneak into a Norman camp. Once inside, he studies their plans and escapes before anyone realizes who he is. It sounds more like a spy thriller than a medieval biography. But this kind of storytelling was very common at the time. Medieval writers loved turning real historical figures into heroic legends, and Hereward was a perfect candidate. After all, he represented something very powerful: resistance. For many English people living under Norman rule, the story of a brave Saxon warrior fighting back against the conquerors would have been extremely appealing, even if parts of the story were exaggerated or completely invented. Eventually, though, the rebellion at Ely came to an end. Norman forces managed to capture the island after building stronger defenses and cutting off supplies. What happened to Hereward afterward is not entirely clear. Some accounts suggest he escaped and lived the rest of his life quietly. Others claim he was eventually captured or killed. The historical record becomes uncertain, which left plenty of room for the legend to grow. Over the centuries, Hereward's story continued to evolve. Writers added new adventures and heroic moments. He became known as Hereward the Wake. The nickname Wake is often interpreted to mean the watchful or the vigilant. In other words, the man who stayed alert and ready to fight. By the 19th century, Hereward had become a national hero in English folklore. Victorian writers and historians loved the idea of a brave Saxon resisting foreign conquerors. They turned him into a symbol of English independence and courage. Books, poems, and novels retold his adventures for new generations. Once again, we see a familiar pattern: a real historical figure, a handful of documented events, and then layer after layer of storytelling turning that person into a legend. So was Hereward the Wake real? Most likely, yes. But the heroic version of Hereward, unstoppable rebel hero who outwitted entire armies, probably exists more in legend than in history. Still, the story tells us something important about the medieval world. People needed heroes, especially during times of uncertainty and political change, and when the real world felt unfair or unstable. Stories about brave rebels offered hope. But not all medieval legends were about warriors or outlaws. Some were much stranger. Some involved curses. Some involved immortality. And one of the most haunting legends in medieval Europe told of a mysterious man condemned to wander the earth forever. A man who could never rest. A man who could never die. A man who had been walking the world for centuries. People claimed to see him in cities across Europe, always traveling, always alone. He became known as Wandering Jew, and his story may be one of the most unsettling legends the medieval world ever created. Throughout medieval Europe, travelers sometimes brought strange stories with them. Stories about distant cities. Stories about unusual creatures. Stories about mysterious people. But among all the legends that circulated across the medieval world, few were as haunting as the tale of the Wandering Jew. According to the legend, this was a man who had committed a terrible act thousands of years earlier, and for that act, he had been cursed. Cursed to walk the earth forever, never aging, never dying, never able to rest. Imagine that for a moment. Everyone you know eventually grows old and passes away. Entire cities rise and fall. Kingdoms appear and disappear. Centuries go by, but you remain, walking endlessly through history. That is the strange fate, the legend assigned to the Wandering Jew. The story usually begins in Jerusalem, during the time of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. According to the legend, as Jesus was being led through the streets carrying the cross, he paused to rest outside a man's house. The man, whose name changes depending on the version of the story, was said to have mocked him. Some versions call him Ahasuerus. Others give him different names. In certain stories, he is a shoemaker. In others, he is a guard or a merchant. But the moment that defines the legend is always the same. The man refuses to show compassion. Instead, he insults Jesus and tells him to keep moving. In response, Jesus supposedly speaks a short but powerful sentence, something along the lines of, "You will keep walking until I return." And with that, the man is cursed. From that moment forward, he is unable to die. He is forced to wander the world until the second coming, the future event when Christians believe Jesus will return. Now, at first glance, this sounds like the kind of story that might remain confined to religious folklore. But during the Middle Ages, the legend spread across Europe in a remarkable way. People began claiming they had seen him. Reports appeared in towns across Germany, France, Italy, and beyond. A traveler would arrive in a village and say they had met a strange man on the road. A man who seemed tired but ageless. A man who spoke about ancient events as if he had witnessed them personally. A man who claimed he had been alive since the time of Jesus. Naturally, people found this deeply unsettling, but also fascinating, because if such a person existed, he would be living proof of divine punishment. And medieval people took religious warnings very seriously. The earliest written versions of the Wandering Jew legend appear in the 13th century. One early account describes an Armenian bishop telling European monks about a mysterious man he had encountered. According to the story, the man admitted he was the cursed figure condemned to wander the earth. He claimed he had seen kingdoms rise and fall. He had walked through deserts, forests, and mountains. He had watched entire generations pass away, and yet he remained alive. Whether anyone truly believed these reports is difficult to know, But the story spread quickly. By the 1500s, printed pamphlets describing encounters with the wandering Jew circulated widely across Europe. Some even included dramatic illustrations showing the mysterious traveler with a walking staff moving endlessly from place to place. Every generation seemed to produce new sightings. A man matching the description would appear somewhere, tell strange stories, then disappear again. Sometimes these stories were clearly exaggerated, but in a world where people believed in miracles, curses, and divine signs, the legend felt possible, and the story carried an important message. It served as a warning. The wandering Jew represented the consequences of rejecting compassion and faith. His endless journey symbolized eternal punishment. In many versions of the story, he deeply regrets what he did. He spends centuries apologizing, praying, and helping others. But the curse remains. He cannot stop walking. He cannot rest. He must wait until the end of time. In that sense, the legend worked almost like a religious parable, a dramatic reminder to treat others with kindness and respect. Unfortunately, the story also developed a darker side. Over time, the Wandering Jew legend became tangled with anti-Jewish prejudice in medieval Europe. Some writers used the story to reinforce harmful stereotypes about Jewish communities. This made the legend more troubling as it spread through later centuries. Modern historians view the story as an example of how medieval myths could sometimes reflect deeper social tensions and fears. But even setting that aside, the Wandering Jew remains one of the most eerie characters in medieval folklore. Unlike heroic figures like King Arthur or Robin Hood, he is not meant to be admired. He is meant to be unsettling. A lonely traveler, trapped by time. And yet, people were strangely drawn to the story. Perhaps because the idea of immortality is both fascinating and frightening. After all, living forever might sound appealing at first. But imagine the loneliness. Watching everyone you care about disappear. Watching the world constantly change. Never being able to stay in one place long enough to belong. The Wandering Jew legend captures that unsettling feeling perfectly, and that may explain why the story lasted so long. Even centuries later, writers and artists continued exploring the idea of the cursed traveler. The character appeared in novels, plays, poems, and paintings across Europe. Each version added new details to the legend, but the core idea remained the same. A man walking endlessly through history, a living reminder of a moment that happened thousands of years ago. And perhaps that is what made the story so powerful, because the medieval world was full of movement pilgrims traveling to holy sites, merchants crossing continents, soldiers marching to war. The image of a lone traveler on a long road was something everyone understood. Except this traveler had no destination, no home waiting at the end, just the road stretching endlessly forward. But not all medieval legends were dark or unsettling. Some were meant to inspire hope. Some celebrated strength, courage, and faith. And one of the most beloved figures in Christian legend was said to be a giant of enormous strength who carried travelers across dangerous rivers, a man whose name appeared in churches all across Europe, a saint whose story blended faith, imagination, and a touch of medieval storytelling magic. He was known as Saint Christopher, and according to legend, he might have been a giant. If you walk into certain very old churches across Europe, you might notice something unusual on the walls. Large paintings, sometimes enormous ones. And in these paintings, there is often a very tall man standing in a river. On his shoulders sits a small child. The man looks strong, but slightly strained, as if the weight he carries is heavier than expected. The figure in these images is Saint Christopher. For many centuries, Saint Christopher was one of the most popular saints in the Christian world. Travelers prayed to him for protection. Pilgrims carried medals with his image. Some people even believed that simply seeing a picture of Saint Christopher in the morning would protect them from danger during the day. But the strange thing about Saint Christopher is that the story most people know about him is almost certainly a legend, and a very imaginative one at that. The most famous version of the story begins with a man of extraordinary size and strength. According to medieval tradition, Christopher was not just a strong man, he was a giant. In some versions of the story, he stood more than 7 feet tall. In others, he was described as towering far above ordinary people. Before becoming a Christian, the giant was said to be searching for the greatest ruler in the world. He wanted to serve the most powerful master he could find. At first, he entered the service of a powerful king. But during his time there, he noticed something strange. Whenever the name of the devil was mentioned, the king appeared afraid. This confused the giant. If the king feared the devil, then perhaps the devil must be more powerful. So Christopher decided to leave and serve the devil instead. Yes, the story gets a little dramatic. According to the legend, Christopher found a band of criminals who were said to serve the devil. He joined them and followed their leader across the countryside. But one day, something unexpected happened. As they traveled down the road, they came across a roadside cross, a symbol of Jesus Christ. When the leader of the criminals saw the cross, he suddenly changed direction and avoided the path. Christopher asked why, and the answer surprised him. The devil, it seemed, feared Christ, which meant Christ must be the most powerful master of all. So once again, the giant set out on a journey. This time, he wanted to find Christ and serve him. But serving Christ was not as simple as joining an army or a royal court. Eventually, Christopher met a hermit who explained that one way to serve Christ was by helping others. Nearby was a dangerous river where travelers often struggled to cross. The current was strong, and there was no bridge. The hermit suggested that Christopher could use his great strength to carry travelers across the water. The giant agreed, and so he spent his days standing by the riverbank, lifting people onto his shoulders and carrying them safely to the other side. It was simple work, but it helped many people. Then one night, according to the legend, a small child appeared beside the river. The child asked Christopher to carry him across. Christopher lifted the boy onto his shoulders and stepped into the water. At first, the journey seemed normal, but with every step, the child began to feel heavier and heavier. Soon, Christopher felt as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world. The river seemed deeper. The current felt stronger. Every step became a struggle. By the time he reached the opposite bank, Christopher was exhausted. He turned to the child and said something like, "You felt as heavy as the whole world." And the child answered with a surprising reply, "You carried not only the world, but the one who created it." At that moment, the child revealed his true identity. He was Christ. In many versions of the story, the child then baptized Christopher in the river, completing his journey from wandering giant to Christian saint. The name Christopher itself is often explained as meaning Christ's bearer, which makes sense, considering the story. The giant who literally carried Christ across the river. It is a powerful image, and medieval people loved it. The story spread across Europe, appearing in books about saints' lives. especially a popular collection called The Golden Legend. This book was one of the most widely read religious texts of the Middle Ages. It included many dramatic and imaginative stories about saints. Saint Christopher's legend fit perfectly. Artists began painting enormous images of him on church walls. These paintings were often placed near entrances so travelers could see them as they came and went. Some of the paintings were incredibly large, sometimes covering entire walls. The idea was simple. Saint Christopher protected travelers, and if you were about to start a long journey, especially during the unpredictable Middle Ages, you probably appreciated any extra protection you could get. But as historians began examining the story more closely, questions started to appear. Was Saint Christopher a real historical figure, or was the story purely symbolic? The earliest references to Christopher appear centuries after the time he supposedly lived. There are no reliable historical records describing a giant man carrying travelers across rivers, and the details of the story change depending on the version. In some early traditions, Christopher was not even a giant. Some texts describe him as having the head of a dog, really before later writers changed the story to make it less unusual. This suggests the legend evolved over time, shaped by different cultures and storytellers. Eventually, many historians concluded that the familiar story of Saint Christopher was probably not a literal historical account. Instead, it functioned more like a symbolic tale. The giant searching for the greatest master represents the search for faith. Carrying travelers across the river represents helping others in their spiritual journey. And carrying Christ represents the ultimate act of service. In other words, the story was meant to teach a lesson rather than record historical events. Even the Catholic Church eventually acknowledged the uncertainty surrounding Christopher's history. In the 20th century, the Church quietly removed Saint Christopher from the official calendar of universal saints due to the lack of reliable historical evidence. However, he is still recognized and venerated in many traditions. And despite the doubts about the literal story, Saint Christopher remains one of the most beloved figures in Christian folklore. His image still appears on medals carried by travelers. Drivers place Saint Christopher charms in their cars, and churches across Europe still display the giant saint carrying a child across the river. Because sometimes the power of a story does not depend on whether every detail is historically accurate. Sometimes the story simply captures something meaningful. In this case, the idea that strength should be used to help others. But the medieval world was not finished creating mysterious figures. Some legends did not involve saints or warriors at all. Instead, they involved travelers who claimed to have seen incredible things in distant lands. Strange creatures, lost kingdoms, unbelievable cultures, and one of the most famous medieval travel books described journeys so bizarre that modern historians now suspect something unusual about its author, because the man who wrote it might not have existed either. His name, according to the book, was Sir John Mandeville. In the Middle Ages, travel stories were incredibly popular. Most people never left the region where they were born. Journeys across continents were rare, difficult, and dangerous. Roads were rough, ships were unpredictable, and travelers had to worry about disease, storms, bandits, and war. So when someone claimed to have traveled across the far edges of the world, people listened very carefully, and few travel stories captured the medieval imagination more than the book known as The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. According to the book, its author was an English knight named Sir John Mandeville. He claimed to have left England in the year 1322 and spent more than 30 years traveling across distant lands. 30 years. That is a very long road trip. During those decades, Mandeville supposedly visited places stretching from the Middle East to Asia, exploring regions that very few Europeans had ever seen. His book described incredible landscapes, fascinating cultures, and creatures that seemed to come straight from a fantasy story, and medieval readers absolutely loved it. The book quickly became one of the most widely read travel accounts in Europe. It was copied by hand, translated into multiple languages, and shared among scholars, nobles, and curious readers. For many Europeans, this book was their window into the wider world. But there was just one small issue. Many of the things Mandeville described were very strange. For example, he wrote about lands where people had faces in their chests instead of their heads. He described tribes with enormous feet that they used as umbrellas when lying in the sun. He claimed there were islands inhabited by dog-headed people who barked instead of speaking. And he spoke of magical regions filled with giants, dragons, and other mythical creatures. Now, medieval readers were used to unusual stories. The world beyond Europe was mysterious and poorly understood. So people were often willing to believe almost anything about distant lands. Still, even by medieval standards, some of Mandeville's claims seemed a little exaggerated, but that did not stop the book from becoming extremely popular. In fact, many readers treated it as a serious geographical guide. The book described journeys through Jerusalem, across the deserts of Persia, through the vast lands of India, and even into the territories of China. Mandeville claimed to have visited the court of the powerful Mongol ruler, Kublai Khan. He described exotic spices, strange animals, and magnificent cities filled with wealth and beauty. Some of these descriptions were surprisingly accurate. Others were clearly not. So what was going on? For centuries, readers assumed Sir John Mandeville had been a real traveler. His book was treated as a genuine memoir of an adventurous knight exploring the world. But as historians began studying the text more carefully, they noticed something interesting. Large parts of the book seemed familiar, very familiar, because they appeared to be copied sometimes almost word for word from other travel accounts. One of the most famous travel writers of the medieval world was Marco Polo, whose journeys across Asia were recorded in the Travels of Marco Polo. Scholars discovered that several passages in Mandeville's book closely resembled descriptions from Marco Polo's work, but it did not stop there. Other sections of the book were borrowed from earlier travel narratives, religious writings, and even medieval encyclopedias about strange creatures. In other words, the book seemed less like a personal travel diary, and more like a collection of stories gathered from many different sources. This raised an obvious question. If the stories came from other writers, who exactly was Sir John Mandeville? Historians began searching for evidence of this supposedly famous traveler. But no matter where they looked, English records, nightly lists, travel documents, they could not find a clear historical person matching the description. There was no reliable record of an English knight named John Mandeville who had traveled the world for 30 years. Some scholars believe the name may have been a pseudonym, a fake identity used by the author of the book. Others suspect the writer might have been a scholar or cleric living somewhere in continental Europe who compiled the stories and invented the character of Sir John Mandeville to make the book more exciting. One theory points to a writer from Liege who may have created the text in the 14th century, but the true identity of the author remains uncertain, which means the famous traveler whose adventures fascinated medieval Europe may have never existed at all. Still, the book itself had an enormous impact. Even if the author did not travel the world, his stories helped shape how Europeans imagined distant lands. For readers who had never left their villages, the book painted a vivid picture of a world filled with wonders. And sometimes, those imagined places influenced real exploration. Centuries later, explorers setting out across the oceans carried books like Mandeville's with them. They hoped to find some of the strange lands and exotic cultures described in its pages. Of course, they did not find people with faces in their chests, but the idea that the world contained incredible and mysterious places continued inspiring travelers for generations. That is the strange power of storytelling again. Even when a story is not entirely true, it can still change the way people see the world. And in the medieval period, the line between fact and imagination was often blurred. A traveler's tale could easily become accepted as history. A fictional knight could become a famous explorer, and a book filled with borrowed stories could become one of the most influential travel accounts of the Middle Ages. In many ways, Sir John Mandeville represents the medieval fascination with the unknown. He symbolizes the curiosity people felt about lands far beyond their own borders, even if the man himself may never have taken those journeys. But medieval storytelling did not only create mysterious travelers, it also created heroes. Heroes who fought bravely in battle. Heroes whose stories were told in epic poems and sung by wandering performers. And one of the greatest heroes of medieval literature was a warrior said to have fought beside the powerful Emperor Charlemagne, a knight so brave that his final battle became one of the most famous heroic stories of the entire Middle Ages. His name was Roland. In medieval Europe, bravery and loyalty were everything. A knight's honor depended on courage, skill in battle, and unwavering loyalty to his lord. And nowhere was this more glorified than in epic poetry. One of the greatest examples of this is the story of Roland, a knight who fought for Charlemagne, one of the most powerful rulers of the early Middle Ages. Roland is the central hero of the epic poem, The Song of Roland, a text that is widely regarded as one of the first great works of French literature. But Roland's story is not just a poem. It is a legend that shaped medieval ideas of what it meant to be a knight. And like many medieval legends, it blends history, imagination, and propaganda in ways that make it hard to tell where fact ends and fiction begins. The poem takes place during Charlemagne's campaign in Spain. Charlemagne is fighting against Muslim forces, trying to expand his empire and defend Christendom. Roland is one of his most trusted knights, celebrated for his courage, skill, and unwavering loyalty. In the poem, Roland is not just brave, he is perfect. Every action he takes is heroic. Every battle he fights is glorious. He embodies the ideal knight, strong, loyal, fearless, and deeply committed to the Christian faith. The most famous episode in Roland's story is the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. According to the poem, Charlemagne's army is marching through the Pyrenees when they are ambushed by a massive enemy force. Roland is in charge of the rear guard, responsible for protecting the army as it moves through the dangerous mountain pass. Here is where the story becomes legendary. Roland's heroism is tested beyond human limits. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he fights fiercely to defend his companions. He refuses to call for help immediately, believing that doing so would dishonor him and show weakness. Only when the battle is nearly lost does he attempt to signal Charlemagne, blowing his Oliphant horn with all his strength. The poem describes the scene in almost cinematic detail. Roland blows the horn so forcefully that the sound bursts his temples, leaving him mortally wounded. He dies heroically, sword in hand, facing the enemy. Even in death, he remains a symbol of courage and loyalty. It is a gripping tale, and it was extremely influential in the medieval world. But here's the thing. Historians believe the real Battle of Rongsvo Pass, which did occur in 778, was very different from the legendary version. The historical battle involves Charlemagne's rear guard being attacked not by Muslim forces, but by Basques, local mountain tribes defending their land. There was no epic display of knights in shining armor. It was a guerrilla-style ambush, brutal, but far less glamorous than the story told in the poem. So how did Roland become the perfect knight? The answer lies in medieval storytelling and politics. Epic poems like the Song of Roland were not just entertainment. They were tools of cultural influence. They glorified Charlemagne as a Christian hero and his knights as ideal warriors, setting a moral and military standard for the nobility. Roland became larger than life. Every act in the poem was meant to inspire admiration and emulate values that were important in medieval Europe: courage, loyalty, piety, and honor. Even elements that seem unrealistic, like blowing the horn until his head bursts, serve a purpose. They show the extreme limits of heroism. The poem also helped define the idea of chivalry, which was central to medieval knightly culture. Chivalry was not just about fighting. It was about moral behavior, loyalty to one's lord, protecting the weak, and serving God. Roland embodies all of these traits in a way that few real knights could. But while Roland is based on a real historical figure, Frankish warrior who died at Rongsvo, almost everything about him in the poem is legend. His actions are exaggerated, his courage idealized, and his death transformed into a symbolic moment for all of Christendom. It is interesting to note that the Song of Roland was composed over 300 years after the actual battle. By the time poets wrote it down, the story had been passed down orally for generations. Each storyteller added their own flair, embellishing events to entertain listeners and inspire admiration. This is a common pattern in medieval storytelling. A real person exists, but the stories surrounding them grow increasingly dramatic over time. Legends often tell us more about the culture that created them than about historical events themselves. Roland's influence extended beyond literature. He became a cultural icon for knights across Europe. Military leaders used his example to teach young nobles about loyalty and bravery. Religious authorities highlighted his faith and devotion as an example of Christian virtue. Even ordinary people admired him, celebrating his courage in local festivals and storytelling. Over time, Roland became almost mythic. He was no longer just a warrior in a battle. He was a symbol of what it meant to be a perfect knight. He was immortalized in art, music, and literature, inspiring generations of writers and artists. In many ways, Roland's legend shows how medieval society used stories to construct ideals. Real historical figures became symbols of cultural values, their actions exaggerated or altered to inspire admiration. Roland is a perfect example. A man who probably existed, a battle that probably happened, and a story that became a moral and cultural model for centuries. But the story also has a darker side. Legends like Roland's were not just about heroism. They were about identity and power. By glorifying Charlemagne and his knights, the poem reinforced the authority of rulers and the social hierarchy. It reminded nobles of their duties, and it gave ordinary people a model of loyalty, bravery, and Christian virtue to admire. This is why legends endure. They entertain, yes, but they also teach, inspire, and reinforce the cultural values of their time. Even today, when we read the Song of Roland, we are seeing the medieval world through its own storytelling lens. Roland's story also demonstrates the blurry line between history and fiction in medieval culture. Unlike modern historical accounts, which rely on careful documentation, medieval stories often combined fact, memory, and imagination. People didn't necessarily need everything to be true. They needed stories that conveyed meaning, values, and inspiration. So while Roland may not have been the perfect knight described in the poem, he remains one of the most important figures in medieval legend. His courage, loyalty, and faith continue to inspire, even if we now recognize that much of his story was invented or exaggerated. And Roland is not the only figure from medieval literature who followed this pattern. Other knights, heroes, and warriors were also transformed into symbols of ideal behavior. One of the most famous examples comes from Spain, El Cid, a real knight whose life was transformed into legend. El Cid's story shares many similarities with Roland's heroic deeds, moral perfection, and battles against enemies who represent chaos or injustice. And like Roland, his story was told in poems, songs, and chronicles that shaped the culture for centuries. The pattern is clear. Real people, semi-historical events, and dramatic storytelling combined to create legends that became more powerful than reality. In the case of Roland, the perfect knight may never have existed exactly as described, but his story endures because it captures the values, ideals, and imagination of medieval Europe. Legends like Roland's show us that medieval storytelling was not just about recording history. It was about creating heroes, defining morality, and giving people symbols they could admire and aspire to. And after Roland, the medieval world continued producing legendary figures, some rooted in reality, some entirely invented, but all serving as mirrors of the society that created them. Next, we will explore El Cid, a real knight whose life became myth, and see how medieval storytellers could take one person's deeds and turn them into almost superhuman legend. In the medieval world, heroes came in many forms. Some were entirely fictional, like King Arthur or Robin Hood. Others were based on real people, whose lives were later exaggerated until the line between fact and fiction was almost impossible to see. One of the best examples of this is El Cid, the legendary Spanish knight. El Cid was a real person. Born in 1043 in Vivar del Cid, his given name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. He grew up during a turbulent period in Spain known as the Reconquista, when Christian kingdoms in the north were slowly pushing back against Muslim-ruled territories in the south. As a young man, Rodrigo became a skilled knight and eventually served King Ferdinand I. He gained a reputation for military skill and loyalty. Over the years, he fought in numerous battles and became a trusted commander. By all historical accounts, he was a formidable warrior and an important figure in the politics and wars of 11th century Spain. But here's where things get interesting. While Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was impressive in real life, the stories that later emerged about him turned him into something almost superhuman. Medieval poets and chroniclers transformed him into El Cid, a hero whose deeds defied human limits. The name El Cid comes from the Arabic word El Sayyid, meaning lord or master. This nickname itself reflects the multicultural environment of medieval Spain, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews often lived and fought in close proximity. El Cid was known for his intelligence, diplomacy, and martial prowess, traits that made him respected by both Christian and Muslim rulers. The legend of El Cid is most famously recorded in the epic poem Cantar de Mio Cid, written in the 12th century, just a few decades after his death. This poem celebrates Rodrigo as the perfect knight, brave, loyal, devout, and almost invincible in battle. One of the most dramatic episodes in the poem is his conquest of Valencia. According to the story, El Cid single-handedly led armies against Muslim forces, showing incredible strategy, courage, and leadership. He is depicted as never losing a battle, always defending the weak, and executing justice with unerring precision. In reality, of course, battles are messy. Victories are rarely so complete, and soldiers are rarely flawless. But the poem removes these complications, creating a hero whose life serves as an ideal example for others. Another striking aspect of El Cid's legend is how he supposedly continued to influence events even after death. Stories emerged that his body, laid out in armor, was placed on his horse, Babiaca, and carried into battle. The sight of El Cid's corpse riding at the head of troops supposedly inspired soldiers to fight harder and even win victories. This story is obviously legendary, but it illustrates a central theme of medieval hero-making, the blending of reality and fantasy to convey moral and cultural ideals. The dead hero becomes more than a person. He becomes a symbol. El Cid's legend also reflects the complex political and religious environment of medieval Spain. Christians were fighting to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers, but the poem emphasizes personal honor, loyalty, and moral virtue over religious hatred. El Cid is often shown as respecting Muslim allies and enemies, demonstrating wisdom alongside bravery. This makes the legend particularly fascinating. Unlike some medieval heroes, whose stories were designed purely to glorify one ruler or religion, El Cid's story balances military heroism, moral integrity, and political savvy. He is a knight who fights for justice, not just for conquest. But how did these legends grow so much beyond the real man? First, medieval chroniclers loved drama. Exaggerating deeds made stories more exciting, more memorable, and more instructive. By turning Rodrigo into El Cid, they created a figure who could teach values such as courage, loyalty, and honor. Second, these stories served political purposes. By celebrating heroic knights, chroniclers reinforced social hierarchies and the importance of noble conduct. El Cid's victories and moral conduct became examples that other nobles could aspire to emulate. Third, the oral tradition played a huge role. Songs, ballads, and recitations spread tales of El Cid long before they were written down. Each storyteller added details, adjusted the plot, and emphasized qualities that would resonate with their audience. Over decades, this process amplified both his accomplishments and his mythic qualities. By the time the Cantar de Mio Cid was written, El Cid had become more than a historical figure. He was an almost legendary hero. Every battle, every duel, and every act of loyalty was exaggerated to reflect ideals of medieval knighthood. Yet, despite the exaggerations, there's a core truth beneath the legend. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivera did exist. He did fight in battles. He did command armies and govern territories. His influence was real, but the stories surrounding him, his near invincibility, his corpse-leading troops, his flawless morality are the work of medieval imagination. This pattern is common in medieval storytelling. Real people become legends. Historical events are reshaped to convey moral or cultural lessons. And over time, the legend often becomes more influential than the historical reality. El Cid's story also shows how heroes can bridge cultures. While the poem celebrates Christian ideals, it also acknowledges the sophistication and power of Muslim rulers. This complexity made El Cid a nuanced figure, not just a one-dimensional warrior. His legend reflects a world where cultures collided, interacted, and influenced one another, which was the reality of medieval Spain. Even today, El Cid remains a symbol of Spanish history and culture. Cities, monuments, and films celebrate his life and legend. People remember him as a hero, a model knight, and a symbol of national pride. But if you peel back the layers of legend, you see the real Rodrigo Diaz, the vibrant, impressive, talented, and ambitious knight whose life inspired generations of storytelling. El Cid also reminds us that the medieval imagination could turn any real person into a cultural icon. By exaggerating deeds, emphasizing moral virtue, and adding dramatic flourishes, storytellers created a figure larger than life who taught lessons, inspired admiration, and became a permanent part of cultural memory. And as we've seen with Roland and now El Cid, there is a pattern emerging. The medieval world loved to create heroes. Some were entirely fictional, others were based on real people, but their stories were exaggerated until they seemed superhuman. And in all cases, these legends reveal not only the values of the time, but also the human fascination with courage, loyalty, and moral perfection. Next, we turn from knights and warriors to the mysterious realm of religious and political myth. Some medieval stories were less about heroes and more about attempts to explain the unknown. Scholars, chroniclers, and storytellers created figures like hidden priest kings to make sense of distant lands, unknown peoples, and the mysteries of the world. In the next chapter, we will explore the priest-king Melchisedech traditions and see how medieval people blended history, scripture, and imagination to explain the world around them. Medieval Europe was a world full of unknowns. Maps were incomplete, borders were fluid, and most people never traveled far from their birthplace. Mountains, deserts, and seas created natural barriers, while political instability and war made distant lands even more mysterious. In this environment, it's not surprising that medieval people turned to imagination, scripture, and rumor to explain the world. One of the most fascinating examples of this is the legend of Melchisedech, or more accurately, the medieval myths that grew up around him. Melchisedech is a figure mentioned in the Bible as a priest-king of Salem who blesses Abraham. But in the Middle Ages, writers and scholars reinterpreted him in ways that transformed him into a mysterious, almost mythical ruler. The legend goes something like this. Melchisedech was no ordinary king. He was a priest-king, ruling a hidden sacred kingdom in a faraway land. Some traditions said his kingdom was still active centuries after the biblical period, guarded by his descendants or faithful priests. In other versions, Melchisedech was associated with esoteric knowledge and divine wisdom, ruling over people who had special insight into the mysteries of God and the cosmos. Why did medieval thinkers latch onto this idea? Partly, it was a matter of curiosity about the unknown. Medieval scholars were keen to understand the world, but they had limited access to reliable information about far-off lands. Scripture offered stories of strange kings, hidden realms, and powerful figures. By connecting contemporary geography and politics with biblical legends, scholars could fill in the blanks of their maps and histories. The Melchisedech traditions often blended with other myths, creating what historians call a composite legend. For example, the story of Prester John, supposed Christian ruler in distant Asia, or Africa borrowed elements from Melchisedech's legend. Prester John was described as ruling a wealthy, pious kingdom full of wonders and exotic creatures. Some scholars and storytellers explicitly claimed that Prester John was a descendant of Melchizedek, connecting biblical authority to contemporary imagination. This blending of stories served several purposes. First, it reinforced the authority of the Christian worldview. If a hidden kingdom ruled by a priest-king existed somewhere on earth, it demonstrated that God's influence extended beyond Europe. It suggested that divine justice, wisdom, and protection were universal, even in lands that Europeans could not see. Second, it helped scholars and rulers make sense of geography. When maps were incomplete and reports from travelers were inconsistent or fantastical, tying unknown regions to biblical legends provided a framework for understanding the world. A distant, mysterious kingdom could be placed somewhere on the map with a story attached, making it feel less uncertain. Third, it was politically useful. Stories of powerful, pious kings in faraway lands could inspire European rulers, justify crusades, or encourage exploration. Crusaders, merchants, and diplomats sometimes hoped to find allies in these legendary kingdoms. A story of Melchizedek, or Prester John, wasn't just a tale, it could guide real decisions. From military strategy to trade missions. One of the key aspects of these legends is how they blurred history, theology, and imagination. Medieval scholars did not always make a strict distinction between what really happened and what must be true. According to scripture or moral reasoning, if a king's lineage could be traced to Melchizedek, his authority was divinely sanctioned. If travelers reported wonders in distant lands, those reports could be incorporated into the legend of a priest-king's realm, even if the traveler had never actually seen them. Melchizedek's mystical qualities also played a role. Unlike most historical kings, he was often depicted as immortal or ageless, a guardian of hidden knowledge. This made him an appealing figure for writers exploring ideas about divine justice, cosmic order, and the eternal nature of sacred authority. Stories about him suggested that even in a chaotic, uncertain world, some forms of wisdom and power remained constant. The legend of Melchizedek also influenced literature and folklore. Medieval texts described him not only as a king, but as a figure associated with secret wisdom, magical artifacts, and hidden cities. Chroniclers wrote about his descendants, maintaining a kingdom that remained unseen by ordinary people, sometimes in the Far East, sometimes in distant mountains or deserts. Travelers' tales were incorporated into these stories, even when the travelers themselves might have been inventing or exaggerating their experiences. In some ways, the Melchizedek traditions set the stage for other legendary figures. Prester John, Sir John Mandeville, and even later explorers like Marco Polo were all shaped by the same impulse: to reconcile the unknown with the known, to fill gaps in understanding with stories that felt true, and to inspire wonder and imagination. The legend also demonstrates how medieval people interpreted history and scripture flexibly. Historical accuracy was not the primary goal. The primary goal was meaning. Melchizedek was not just a king, he was a symbol, a hidden ruler of wisdom and virtue who represented God's order in the world. Stories about him offered moral lessons, guidance for rulers, and inspiration for travelers and scholars alike. By connecting Melchizedek with other legends, medieval thinkers created a web of myth that extended across centuries and continents. This web was not static. Stories evolved as they were copied, translated, and retold, Elements were added, removed, or modified to suit local culture, political needs, or religious interpretation. The result was a rich tapestry of myths in which history, imagination, and moral instruction were tightly interwoven. Even today, the influence of these traditions can be seen in literature, art, and cultural memory. The idea of a hidden, wise ruler in a distant land has inspired countless stories, from early modern travel accounts to modern fantasy novels. The appeal remains the same: a figure who embodies wisdom, authority, and moral perfection, hidden away in a world that ordinary people can only imagine. What makes Melchisedech and priest-king legends in general particularly fascinating is how serious medieval people took these stories. They were not simply entertainment. They were a way to understand the universe, the divine, and the unknown. Scholars debated the locations of Melchizedek's kingdom. Clerics referenced him in sermons. Kings and nobles sometimes imagined alliances with such figures in distant lands. In other words, these legends were practical as well as imaginative. They shaped beliefs, guided exploration, and informed diplomacy. They remind us that in a world without widespread literacy, incomplete maps, and limited travel, storytelling was a tool for survival, understanding, and ambition. And while Melchizedek's priest-king might never have existed as described, the legend had real consequences. It influenced explorers to venture into unknown lands. It inspired scholars to study geography, history, and theology more deeply. It provided a framework for thinking about authority, morality, and divine order. In the end, the Melchizedek traditions show how medieval imagination could turn a biblical figure into a timeless symbol. A historical reference became a legend. A legend guided thought, action, and exploration. And centuries later, we can still trace the echoes of these stories in the way people imagine hidden kingdoms, secret knowledge, and the power of moral and spiritual authority. From saints like Christopher to knights like Roland and El Cid, and finally to priest-kings like Melchizedek, the medieval imagination was a powerful force. It could turn ordinary people into heroes, historical figures into mythic icons, and scripture into the blueprint for distant worlds and hidden kingdoms. Next, we will explore the Green Man and other historical forest figures. Legends rooted in nature, spirituality, and folklore. These figures, like the priest-kings, were often treated as ancient or historical, even when they were products of imagination and cultural symbolism. The medieval world loved mysteries, and the forest was one of the greatest mysteries of all. It was in these woods that stories of strange men, spirits, and guardians emerged, blending folklore, religion, and a touch of historical fantasy. If you've ever wandered into an old European church or cathedral, you may have noticed something strange carved into the stonework. A face surrounded by leaves. Sometimes it's subtle, hidden among intricate designs. Other times, it glares down from a wooden beam or a towering arch. This mysterious figure is known as the Green Man, one of the most fascinating examples of medieval historical figures who may never have existed. The Green Man is typically depicted as a face-often human sprouting leaves from the mouth, nose, or eyes. Sometimes he is entirely made of foliage. Some carvings show him as smiling, others as stern or even menacing. Despite the variations, the symbolism is clear. He represents nature, growth, and the cycles of life and death. Medieval people sometimes treated these figures as historical beings. They were more than decoration. They were part of the cultural and spiritual landscape. Stories about the Green Man and other forest figures blended folklore, religious symbolism, and oral tradition in a way that made them feel real to the people of the time. The Green Man is just one example of a broader category of legendary figures connected to forests and rural life. In a world where most people lived close to the land, the forest was mysterious, dangerous, and sacred. It was home to wild animals, bandits, and sometimes spirits or supernatural beings. Figures like the Green Man, wood spirits, and forest guardians personified the forest's power and mystery. One reason these figures were treated as historical or at least real in the cultural sense is that medieval people were highly attuned to symbolism. Nature was not just scenery, it was an active force. Trees, rivers, and animals had spiritual significance, and the people believed that forests were inhabited by beings with real influence over daily life. A story about a forest guardian could serve as a warning to children, a lesson for adults, or a spiritual metaphor, all while feeling as real as any king or saint. The Green Man is often linked to pagan traditions. Scholars believe that his imagery predates Christianity in Europe, representing fertility, rebirth, and the cycles of the seasons. When Christianity spread across the continent, the figure was incorporated into church architecture, blending pagan symbolism with Christian teachings. In some cases, he was paired with saints or biblical motifs, merging the natural world with spiritual instruction. But the figure also evolved into folklore. Legends describe the Green Man as a spirit who protects the forest, punishes those who harm nature, and occasionally guides or tests humans. In some stories, he is seen wandering the woods, teaching lessons, or offering aid. Sometimes, he is mischievous or dangerous, reflecting the unpredictable power of the natural world. Other historical forest figures from medieval Europe include beings like wild men, sometimes called wodowases. These figures were hairy, human-like creatures who lived outside civilization. They were often portrayed carrying clubs or sticks and surviving in the wilderness. Chroniclers, legal documents, and even heraldry sometimes treated them as real, at least in the cultural imagination. People reported sightings, local stories circulated, and artists depicted them in manuscripts and tapestries. These figures served several purposes in medieval culture. Moral lessons. Forest beings often symbolized the wild, untamed parts of human nature. Stories of encounters with them could warn against greed, violence, or disobedience. Spiritual symbolism. The Green Man, in particular, represented rebirth and the cycles of life, linking the natural world to spiritual truths. Entertainment. Tales of wild men and forest spirits were thrilling, mysterious, and sometimes humorous. They were perfect for oral storytelling, performed at feasts, markets, and festivals. Cultural identity. Local legends about forest spirits or ancient guardians reinforced community identity. Certain forests or landmarks became sacred or special, tied to stories that were passed down for generations. Interestingly, these figures were often treated as historical in the sense that people believed they truly existed somewhere, even if unseen. Medieval belief in the realness of strange creatures, giants, or supernatural beings was common. People didn't require empirical evidence in the modern sense. Oral tradition, sacred texts, and local testimony were sufficient to convince them of a figure's existence. The Green Man also illustrates how art and storytelling reinforce belief. Repeated imagery in churches, manuscripts, and public spaces made the figure part of everyday life. Even without ever seeing him in the forest, people accepted the Green Man as a real presence in their world. The same is true for wadwasses and other legendary figures. Representation created reality in the medieval imagination. Medieval chroniclers sometimes blended real history with these forest legends. For instance, noble families would claim that their ancestors had encounters with wild men or other mystical beings, connecting their lineage to ancient or divine power. This is similar to the way the priest-king Melchisedech legends connected rulers to sacred authority, or how knights like Roland and El Cid became semi-mythical heroes. In addition, forests themselves were dangerous. Travelers could get lost, preyed upon by animals, or attacked by bandits. Having a figure like the Green Man or a Woodwose personified those dangers. People could talk about the forest as if it were inhabited by intelligent, powerful beings, creating a narrative that made sense of risk, mystery, and morality. Over time, the Green Man became more than a regional figure. Artists incorporated him into cathedrals across Europe, from England to France, Germany to Italy. He appeared not only in stone and wood carvings, but also in stained glass, manuscripts, and even coins. His imagery persisted well into the Renaissance and remains visible in churches and historic buildings today. The enduring appeal of the Green Man and similar figures highlights the human fascination with nature and myth. These stories are neither purely factual nor purely symbolic. They occupy a space where imagination, morality, and cultural memory intersect. Medieval people treated them as historical in the sense that they influenced behavior, inspired awe, and guided understanding of the world. In many ways, the Green Man and other forest figures serve as a bridge between the human and natural worlds. They remind us that medieval society did not see humans as separate from nature, but as part of a complex, interconnected system. Forest legends reinforced respect for the environment, caution about unknown dangers, and recognition of the cycles of life and death. It's also worth noting that these forest figures sometimes interacted with humans in stories. Travelers, knights, or peasants might encounter a Green Man, a wadwas, or other forest spirit. Such encounters could test courage, morality, or cleverness. These tales often combine adventure with lessons, creating narratives that entertained while instructing. And while many of these figures were never real in the literal sense, they were very real in medieval culture. Communities, travelers, and storytellers treated them as part of the historical and moral landscape. Their existence influenced behavior, belief, and art just as much as the stories of knights, saints, and priest-kings. In a way, these figures were part of the same world as Roland, El Cid, and Prester John. Medieval imagination did not always distinguish between human heroes, sacred rulers, or supernatural beings. Legends served multiple purposes, explaining the unknown, reinforcing cultural values, inspiring morality, and entertaining audiences. The Green Man Woodwoses and other forest figures also illustrate the persistence of myth in everyday life. Unlike epic heroes or saints, who were celebrated in poetry or church chronicles, forest figures were woven into ordinary life seen on buildings, recounted at markets, and discussed during daily work. This integration shows how deeply legend could permeate medieval society. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Green Man had become an enduring symbol of nature, mystery, and the blending of history and imagination. Even as literacy increased and more accurate maps appeared, these figures continued to appear in art and literature. They remind us that human fascination with the unknown and the unexplained is timeless, and as we've seen with the Green Man, the line between history and legend was often blurry. Medieval people accepted stories as true in ways that modern readers might find surprising. But these stories were meaningful. They conveyed values, warned of dangers, inspired imagination, and helped people understand a complex world. Next, we'll explore why all these legends, knights, saints, priest kings, and forest spirits centered. We'll examine the psychological, cultural, and societal reasons that medieval people believed these figures were real, and why the stories continue to captivate us even today. In the next chapter, we'll ask the question, why did medieval people believe these figures were real? And the answer will reveal a lot about storytelling, authority, and the human desire for heroes.
By now, we've met a host of fascinating characters, some entirely invented, like Prester John or the Wandering Jew. Others based on real people, but transformed into legends, like Roland and El Cid. And still others, like the Green Man, whose existence was more symbolic than literal. But there's a common thread connecting all of them. Medieval people, by and large, believed these figures were real. And to understand why, we have to look at the mindset, culture, and conditions of the Middle Ages. One of the first things to consider is literacy, or the lack of it. The majority of people in medieval Europe could not read or write. Literacy was mostly limited to the clergy, some nobles, and a handful of merchants. Stories were passed down orally through minstrels, monks, town criers, or traveling merchants. In an oral culture, repetition creates authority. The more often a tale was told, the more true it became in the minds of listeners. Imagine hearing the same story about a heroic knight or a mysterious priest king dozens of times in your life. Each storyteller adds a flourish, emphasizes the hero's courage, or invents a dramatic encounter. By the time it reaches your ears, the story feels like fact. There's no footnote saying this may be exaggerated. There's just the tale, vivid and alive. Second, the authority of storytellers mattered. Monks, chroniclers, and clerics were seen as trustworthy sources. If a monk wrote that Pope Joan had reigned for a few years, or that St. Christopher was enormous enough to carry travelers across a river, people tended to accept it. Religious or scholarly authority carried weight. Medieval audiences were not trained to question sources in the modern sense. They trusted the educated, the literate, and the sacred. This authority also extended to political figures. Kings, nobles, and local leaders often promoted legends that reinforced their power. The story of King Arthur, for example, became intertwined with the idea of a united Britain and a moral code for kings and knights. Prester John, meanwhile, inspired European rulers to imagine alliances in far-off lands, even if no such ruler existed. Stories were practical tools as well as entertainment. They shaped politics, law, and military strategy. A third reason medieval people believed in these figures is the lack of reliable records. In a world without newspapers, photography, or modern archives, information was patchy. Wars, fires, and political upheavals destroyed documents. If no one could prove or disprove a story, it was easy for it to be accepted. Absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. Take the case of Robin Hood. No official records confirm his existence, yet stories of a heroic outlaw persisted for centuries. The fact that people couldn't easily check the historical record allowed the legend to flourish. Similarly, Sir John Mandeville's travels might have been impossible. But without widespread fact-checking, the stories became a reference for what the world might look like. Fourth, there was the power of storytelling itself. Medieval narratives were vivid, dramatic, and full of moral or symbolic meaning. People did not just consume stories for entertainment. They internalized them as lessons, warnings, or inspiration. Legends often had clear moral frameworks. Courage was rewarded, betrayal punished, and divine justice ensured. If a story carried a moral or spiritual truth, the audience was more likely to accept the surrounding facts, even if they seemed improbable. Humans also have a natural desire for heroes, villains, and the extraordinary. People want figures to admire and fear, to explain the world's chaos and inspire courage. In a society full of uncertainty, plagues, wars, famine stories about heroic knights, Righteous kings and fearsome enemies provided structure and meaning. Believing in these figures gave people a sense of order, hope, and morality. Religious and spiritual beliefs played a huge role as well. Medieval Europe was deeply religious. People believed in miracles, saints, divine intervention, and curses. If a story suggested that a saint walked among men, or a figure like the wandering Jew wandered the earth forever, it made sense within the framework of faith. These legends often reflected medieval fears, hopes, and moral lessons. They were a way of understanding life and death, justice and punishment, sin and redemption. The social function of these legends cannot be overstated. Heroes like Roland and El Cid provided models for noble conduct, loyalty, and courage. Figures like Pope Joan or the Wandering Jew offered cautionary lessons about morality, gender, and divine retribution. Forest spirits like the Green Man taught respect for nature and warned of human folly. Each story reinforced values, norms, or beliefs, making it more believable in the eyes of the audience. Another factor was oral and visual reinforcement. Think about it. People saw statues, carvings, manuscripts, and paintings of these figures. Churches displayed saints and frescoes. Cathedrals carved faces and foliage for the Green Man. Nobles recited tales of El Cid at feasts, seeing a figure depicted repeatedly in art, hearing stories told by authoritative voices, and discussing them in everyday life reinforced belief. The legends became woven into the cultural fabric. Psychology also played a role. Medieval people were accustomed to magical thinking, seeing causality in events, attributing meaning to coincidences, and interpreting dreams or omens as real. A strange death, a miraculous survival, or a vivid encounter in a forest could easily be explained by the actions of legendary figures. Seeing proof in the form of stories, sightings, or art was enough to convince many that these characters were real. Finally, cultural memory and tradition helped preserve these beliefs across generations. Even after literacy increased and maps became more accurate, legends persisted because they were deeply embedded in society. Communities, churches, and families passed stories down. People remembered them not as fiction, but as part of their heritage. That's why centuries later we still recognize names like King Arthur, Robin Hood, and Prester John when historical evidence is weak or non-existent. In short, medieval people believed these figures were real because of a combination of factors. Limited access to information, few could verify stories independently. Authority of storytellers, monks, clerics, and chroniclers were trusted sources. Oral tradition, repetition, made stories feel factual. Moral and symbolic meaning, legends conveyed values and lessons. Psychological need for heroes and order, stories helped people cope with chaos. Religious belief, divine intervention, miracles, and curses reinforced credibility. Visual reinforcement, art, architecture, and manuscripts made stories tangible. Cultural memory, traditions preserved belief across generations. All of these factors combined to create a medieval worldview where the extraordinary seemed possible and the line between reality and imagination was fluid. The stories did more than entertain, they guided behavior, inspired courage, shaped politics, and preserved cultural identity. This helps explain why figures like the Wandering Jew wandered the earth in the minds of countless Europeans for centuries. Why Pope Joan remained a subject of debate, and why Roland's heroics could define the ideals of knighthood. Legends were not lies in the modern sense. They were truths that mattered in a cultural, moral, and spiritual context. Even when later generations questioned the historical accuracy, the legends endured. People often preferred the power of the story to the limitations of factual history. A heroic narrative, a mystical figure, or a wise king could inspire, teach, and captivate in ways that mere facts could not. And that's why these medieval figures, whether knights, saints, or forest spirits, continue to capture our imagination today. They remind us that belief is not just about evidence, it's about meaning, culture, and the human desire for stories that make life richer, braver, and more mysterious. In the next and final chapter, we'll explore how myths become history, and why many of these legendary figures remain part of our culture and imagination long after their real existence has been questioned. We'll see how stories can survive centuries, influencing literature, art, and popular culture, and why people still love to believe in them.
We've traveled through centuries of legend. Knights like Roland and El Cid, saints like Christopher, mysterious kings like Prester John and Melchisedech, and forest spirits like the Green Man. Some of these figures were rooted in real people. Others were entirely imagined, yet they all share one remarkable quality. They became history in the minds of medieval people. But how does a myth, a story, or a character born from imagination, rumor, or moral allegory transform into history? And why do these legends persist even today? The process starts with repetition and authority. When a story is told over and over, it acquires credibility. Monks recorded tales and chronicles, often mixing fact and fiction without making a distinction. These chronicles were seen as historical records. If a respected monk wrote that Pope Joan ruled in the 9th century, or that Charlemagne's rearguard included the perfect knight Roland, it was accepted as fact. Over time, these repeated stories solidified into a shared understanding of history, even if there was no evidence. Consider King Arthur, perhaps the most famous example of a fictional figure treated as historical. By the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain presented Arthur as a real king, complete with wars, alliances, and noble deeds. Subsequent chroniclers accepted this version, adding their own embellishments. By the late Middle Ages, Arthur was treated by many as a genuine historical figure. Even when modern historians find no archaeological proof of Camelot or Excalibur, Arthur persists in collective memory as a king who once lived. A second factor is cultural need. Legends often serve as mirrors of societal values. Medieval Europe faced political instability, war, famine, and disease. Stories of heroes, virtuous rulers, and moral exemplars offered guidance, comfort, and a sense of order. Figures like Roland and El Cid provided ideals of courage, loyalty, and justice. Saints' legends demonstrated the rewards of faith and morality. The Green Man and forest spirits reflected humanity's connection to nature and the cycles of life. Even when these figures never existed as described, they became historical because they fulfilled real psychological and cultural needs. Another crucial mechanism is integration into institutions. Many myths were incorporated into religious, political, or educational frameworks. Saints were canonized, their feast days celebrated, and churches built in their honor. Knights' tales were recited at courts, teaching chivalric ideals. Priest-king legends like Melchisedech and Prester John were referenced in theological debates, diplomatic letters, and maps of distant lands. Institutional recognition lent stories a veneer of factual authority, reinforcing the perception that these figures were real. Oral tradition also played a huge role. Before widespread literacy, stories spread through speech, song, and performance. Oral narratives are flexible. They change slightly with each telling, emphasizing particular traits or moral lessons. Over time, these variations coalesced into a shared version of the legend, which people then treated as factual. The more people heard a story, the more real it became in their minds, until generations later, it was as credible as any recorded event. We also see the power of visual reinforcement. Medieval Europe was saturated with imagery. Illuminated manuscripts, frescoes, sculptures, and stained glass. Seeing a saint depicted with specific attributes, or a mythical knight immortalized in sculpture, made the stories tangible. People could see the legend in the material world, which made belief easier. Art and architecture were more than decoration. They were instruments of memory, teaching, and cultural continuity. Interestingly, Myths often adapted to new historical contexts, which reinforced their persistence. Take Prester John, originally imagined as a Christian king in Asia. His legend evolved as Europeans explored Africa and India. Each new report, however fanciful, was folded into the story, making it feel even more real. Similarly, stories of Roland and El Cid adapted to local context. Ballads, poems, and chronicles emphasized aspects of the hero that resonated with contemporary audiences. Legends survived because they were flexible, able to accommodate new information, new fears, and new moral lessons. Another reason myths become history is the human preference for narrative over facts. People remember stories more than dates, names, or raw events. A gripping tale of a heroic knight defeating impossible odds leaves a deeper impression than a battle report listing troop numbers and casualties. Medieval audiences, and even modern ones, naturally prioritize the emotional and moral weight of a story. When repeated across generations, narrative power often outweighs historical accuracy. Psychology plays a role too. People are predisposed to believe what fits their worldview or reinforces their beliefs. If a story validates faith, moral principles, or social hierarchies, it is more readily accepted. The Wandering Jew, for instance, reflected medieval fears and religious ideals, while tales of saintly miracles confirmed divine authority. Belief was often less about evidence and more about meaning. The persistence of these myths also stems from social cohesion. Communities, courts, and religious institutions shared these stories as part of their identity. Believing in shared heroes or legendary figures reinforced collective memory, provided common values, and fostered a sense of belonging. Historical truth became intertwined with cultural narratives, so much so that it could feel like questioning the community itself. Even after the Renaissance, when literacy increased and historians began emphasizing empirical evidence, many of these legends remained influential. King Arthur continued to inspire literature and nationalism. El Cid became a symbol of Spanish identity. The Green Man persisted in art and folklore. These myths became cultural touchstones, surviving even as historical methods advanced. Another layer is the blurring of real and fictional individuals. Some legends started with historical figures and expanded into myths. Roland probably existed in some form. El Cid definitely did. But as poets and chroniclers embellished their deeds, their stories became historical in the cultural imagination. Over time, people treated the legendary and the real as inseparable, reinforcing the myth's longevity. The interplay between myth and history also highlights the power of imagination in shaping perception. Medieval people lived in a world with limited information and vast unknowns. Myths were tools for understanding, teaching, and navigating this uncertainty. A story could explain natural phenomena, moral dilemmas, political alliances, or military campaigns in ways that dry facts could not. Over centuries, repeated stories solidified into history, even if the events were partially or wholly invented. Modern culture continues this pattern. Films, books, and television shows treat King Arthur, Robin Hood, and El Cid as if they were real, further blurring the line between history and legend. Tourism, reenactments, and popular culture reinforce these stories. In a way, these figures live on because human fascination with heroes, morality, and the extraordinary never fades. We may know more about the historical realities behind the legends, but the stories still capture imagination. In essence, myths become history through authority, repetition, visual reinforcement, cultural need, and narrative power. They endure because they satisfy psychological, moral, and social needs, and because they are flexible enough to adapt to new contexts and new audiences. Legends are not just lies, they are truths of a different kind. Truths about belief, identity, morality, and imagination. When we study medieval legends, we are not only looking at invented stories or embellished biographies. We are seeing how humans create meaning, inspire others, and connect with the unknown. Legends like Roland, El Cid, Prester John, and the Green Man show us that history is not just about facts, it's about the stories people choose to believe, share, and pass down. And that brings us full circle. Medieval legends endure not because they were always true, but because they became true in the hearts and minds of people. They shaped morality, inspired courage, guided exploration, and formed cultural memory. They remind us that history is as much about imagination and belief as it is about dates and documents. So the next time you hear a story about a legendary knight, a mysterious king, or a strange forest spirit, remember this. For centuries, these figures were real enough to guide actions, inspire, awe, and shape culture. Whether they existed in the literal sense or not, their influence is undeniable. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of medieval myth, the power to make imagination into history. History, after all, is not only what happened, it is also what people believe happened, and what they carry forward into the future. Medieval legends prove that sometimes belief can be just as powerful and just as lasting as fact. And that brings us to the end of our journey through some of the most famous medieval figures who may never have existed at all. It's fascinating to think about how stories can travel across centuries, growing, changing, and sometimes becoming so convincing that they begin to feel like real history. In the medieval world, where storytelling, rumor, and legend often blended together, it's no surprise that a few imaginary characters managed to live on in people's memories for hundreds of years. But that's also part of what makes history so interesting. The deeper we look, the more we discover that the past isn't just made of kings, battles, and dates, but also myths, misunderstandings, and the powerful stories people chose to believe. If you enjoyed this relaxing dive into medieval legends, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling us which historical myths or mysterious figures you'd like to explore next. And if you're in the mood for more calm and fascinating history, be sure to check out the other videos on the screen now. There are plenty more quiet journeys into the past waiting for you. Thank you for spending a little time in history with us today, and we'll see you in the next video.